Pamela Anggraini. It is such a wonderful and grateful change for us to be the master of ceremony for this event. So we welcome you all to the international seminar about global political economy and governance with the main title International Financial Institutions, World Bank, IMF, Trade, GATT, and WTO, and its impact on labor and environment.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the first agenda will be a welcoming speech. Allow us to invite Mr. Habibie Subandi as the coordinator of today's agenda to deliver his welcoming speech. Mr. Habibie, are you here with us?
Okay, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Maybe I give a short speak about this program. This program is initiated by me in the Department of Political Science. We have gone through about 6 discussions previously. We are doing the 3-in-1 program visiting professors. Actually, there were two professors were joining this program. The first is Professor Bulbul Darjem. She is from Jamia Millia Islamia University, India, and the second one is Dr. Muhammad Koyum. He is the professor in. He is the alumni of University of Indonesia, and he is the practitioner. And this program is entitled Global Political Economy and Governance, with special reference to Southeast Asia. And our today's meeting is the 7th meeting of the 6 previously. And this meeting will be held in the mode of international seminar. Joining here is Dr. Anggun as our speaker and Dr. Exakilian also as our speaker. And for today's meeting, Dr. Anggun would like to speak about the impact of international finance institutions on environment. I think that is the topic that Mr. Anggun will speak about. And the second speaker, Dr. Elza Kilian, she would like to give remarks on global political economy, global trade agreements with special reference to Indonesia. And Professor Bulbul Darjem would like to speak the main topics as about international financial institutions. She would like to give a theoretical framework on how to understand WTO, IMF, and World Bank rules in international trade. And I was contacted by Professor Bulbul Darjem about 30 minutes ago, and she is still in the hospital, and she would like to join our program on 12:30 Indian Standard Time. It means that she will be able to join at 14:00 Indonesian time, waktu Indonesia Barat. Jadi I don't know what problem she had, but she might join us at 12:30 Indian Standard Time, or it is equal to 14 hours at waktu Indonesia Barat. And I think that is my opening, the opening for me, and I would like to hand over again to the Master of Ceremony.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Habibie, for your delightful speech.
So, ladies and gentlemen, now we are proceeding to the next seminar agenda. The first presentation will be delivered by Dr. Anggun Trisnanto Harisusilo. Mr. Anggun will be bringing the topic regarding impact of international institutions on environment and water resources. So beforehand, let me review the profile of Mr. Anggun himself. Mr. Anggun is a lecturer in Department of International Relations of Universitas Brawijaya, and he took the expertise in international political economy, rural governance, financial institutions, and international development. Mr. Anggun is an alumni of Universitas Airlangga for his bachelor degree and continuing his study in Monash University, and took his PhD program in International Institute of Social Science, Erasmus University Rotterdam, Netherlands. So first of all, Mr. Anggun, are you here with us?
Yes. Can you hear my voice clearly?
Yes, it's audible, sir.
Okay. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, sir.
Yes.
Now I will pass the floor to Mr. Anggun. Sir, you may have the floor.
Okay. So thank you very much, Tia, Stefani. Yeah, as I see your names on the screen, and Mr. Habibi Subandi, and also my colleagues from International Relations Department, Ibu Erza Kilian. I'm sure that you are now in the office, right? Yeah, I can see your background. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank to the Department of Political Science for inviting me in this lovely and lively international seminar on international political economy. So I think this is my first time to join with the three-in-one, I think three-in-one scheme, right? Yeah, Pak Habibie. And I really like to share with you my experience and then my educational background, as well as my research, in particular, the World Bank and institutionalism. So before I start to share with you my PowerPoint, so I would like to make clear that today, this afternoon, the topic that I will deliver is about institutionalism. Yeah, it is a part of the relatively new method conducted or introduced by one of the leading institution in international development, which is the World Bank, and how this a kind of a new method institutionalism applied in developing countries like Indonesia. So if you don't mind, I would like to share with you my PowerPoint. So, okay, can you see the slide on your screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So as I said before, today's topic I think is a broader sense of environment. Yeah, what I would like to refer mostly in a social environment. It's not really touching upon on water and sanitation, even though that is also my expertise, water and sanitation. But it's more important here, I think, to talk about the what is called institutionalism and how it is applied in many developing countries, including Indonesia. So let me know if the slide is not really moving. Yeah. Okay. Why we should talk about institutionalism? So it is start, I think, in late 50s. Yeah, I think it was in 1950 something. It's 1959. Yeah, we actually the World Bank itself, as a leading international development organization, had an bad experience of implementation of a development project in African countries. So economic development and also stimuli of market-led development that were applied at the time in Africa was not really working. Yeah, what was found was about the problem of what they called institution. Yeah, so they found rampant corruption and then weak institution and a problem of crook and elite capture and other problems that are related, yeah, with the performance of institution. And finally, this problem led to the more acute problem of governance. Yeah? So I think we already understand and broadly discuss about the role of governance in market-led development. So historically, the World Bank start to change its strategy. Yeah, so here I wrote, you know, so instead of making price right, yeah, so one of the uh, mostly discussed was about price. So getting institution right was sort of paradigm that was introduced by the World Bank, which was inspired by the idea of new institutional economic, yeah, that was proposed by Douglas North. I think one of the most lively discussion about the evolution of economic development was about this one, NIE, New Institutional Economics. So the idea that was taken by the World Bank was pretty much by Douglas North and his team in a university. And then it was start to widespread the application of NIE throughout developing countries since 1950s onwards. So from this slide, then we can summarize that the first thing about the introduction to institution was about the idea of replacing price as a main commodity, quote unquote. Then it was replaced by institution as a main strategy, mostly proposed by the World Bank. Okay. Now, I think we should clearly understand what really is institution. Largely, when we talk about institution, we almost maybe 100% understand institution as a part of organization. So when we talk about institution in informal or formal meetings, in academia, in other communities, mostly we referring to organization, which is also correct. However, new institutional economics that was proposed by NIE, mostly by the Douglas North, institution is not only about organization, but here institution can be understood in two ways. The first thing, institution as a rules and regulation, yeah, or we call it a formal institution. And the second one, institution as a norms and values, that we call it informal institution. If you're looking at development programs that are now on the ground, that I will talk about this shortly, you will find a lot of them, or part of them, is about this one. So they establish organization, yeah, as a representative of institution, as well as setting rules and regulation that can support the implementation of development programs. However, as I found in many of literatures as well as research on the ground, the role of norms and values pretty much influence or to some extent determines the way of those development projects are implemented. So in essence, we will find that the dynamics, yeah, the word dynamics should be highlighted here. The dynamics of institution as part of a big idea that was proposed by the World Bank is really touching on the ground and interface one in another. The informal institution influence the formal ones and vice versa. That at the end will determine the whole performance of organization. So that is a basic understanding of institution that is mainly derived from the way we understand institution from new institutional economics. Okay, now we go more deeply into our case. So institution, of course, since it was proposed, discovered in the late 1950s, is really applied in Indonesia. So whenever you hear about the corruption eradication agencies, yeah, KPK, or the program that is supported by the donors, yeah, not only World Bank but also USAID, and then AUSAID as the main donor to Indonesia. So you will hear or you will see that strengthening institution is one of the major agendas. They believe that to overcome the problems of governance, yeah, the problem of corruption, elite capture, and in sorry, I should. Hey, my door. Okay, so back to our topic this afternoon. Strengthening institution is one of the major agendas in many international donors that are operating in Indonesia. So the strengthening the agency of KPK and then police department and local government, yeah, in many kind of projects that are applied in Indonesia is mostly part of the strengthening institution. Yeah. So they believe, development, yeah, mainly economic development, can be achieved, can be further by strengthening institution. Okay, next to this kind of agenda that also important that we should highlight is about law enforcement. So I think this agenda is hand in hand with the strengthening institution in order to actually, so some observers, critical observers, see that this kind of thing on law enforcement and strengthening institution is to support market. Yeah, that is the political economy side of this thing. Then the next point is about mainstreaming institution in development. So here in Indonesia, that we observe you will find that rules and regulations and then law enforcement, any kind of intervention, mainly by international donors, they would like to make it as a mainstream. Yeah. So you can find in programs like poverty reduction and then family support program like PKH, and also more importantly to the village law, yeah, law number 6, 2014, you can see that that is the way of intervention, yeah, by the international donors like USAID, World Bank, and others to make it mainstream. The institution is the very key as the ultimate weapon, as a main tools to advance development. So instead of intervention directly to the market, so they like using different kind of things to make it better work. And then a final point in the Indonesian case, whenever you're looking at those kind of international projects, is the attention to a sustaining institution. So whenever the interventions ends in a certain period, yeah, maybe you will see that the program is last for 5, maximum 10 years. And then after that, they will initiate organization to sustain. Yeah. So this is kind of modus operandi that we see on the ground on how the World Bank try to intervene Indonesian development project or any kind of project that is also established in developing countries through the attempt to mainstream the institution approach into rules and regulation, law enforcement, and other things that I have said earlier. Okay, now we touch upon on the heart of the politics. Yeah. So what is the lesson learned or point that we can take from this experience? So actually the politic of institutionalism is derived from the attention that the way international donors see the Indonesian bureaucracy is something that is always worse. It is always bad. It is full of interest. Yeah. So the attention of this one, so I put it here, embedded interest inside bureaucracy. So why the World Bank has this kind of strategy? Because they see that the really problem of developing country is in its own bureaucracy. It's a full of interest. It is a full of corruption and other things that are correlated with the problem of governance. So because of that, the implementation of institutionalism in most developing countries is by insulation technique. What does it mean, insulation? Insulation, it means that the program, the institution that are initiated by those international donors, mainly by the World Bank, is separate, yeah, is in parallel, is separate from Indonesian bureaucracy. So the way they implement the program actually not really engaging with the whole body of bureaucracy. Why? Because they see that there is a distrust to the state. They don't believe the state because state are full of corruption and full of problems that finally hinder from the economic development development of a certain state. So the way of see this kind of thing for me is a kind of politics. So institutionalism or institutional approach that is applied in Indonesia is not really part of the agenda of Indonesian itself, but it's something that is pushed, something that is forward by the external power, because the way they see the development process in Indonesia or in other countries is not really good according to their lens, according to the Western lens, according to the Western theory. And that's why they try to push it, they try to intervene by establishing institution. But the way they see, the way they react, the way they perceive development from their perspective is called, for me, I call it politics. Yeah. Okay. Of course, institutionalism is not a perfect approach. Yeah, it's not without problems. So here I list some problems that are embedded inside the application of institutionalism in Indonesia. The first thing is a problem of coordination. So in practice, of course, establishment of institution is a kind of a complex system that is called participation, coordination among involved agencies. But the problem that I was found on my research is the coordination between those kind of agencies. If you looking at the politics of bureaucracy in local government, you will see clearly that each institution, each organization has a sectoral ego. Yeah, because they think that they have their own power. They don't need to talk to another agencies. That finally leads to the problem of coordination. Yeah. Then the second problem that is also important here is about the elite capture, especially when we analyze the long administrative processes in Indonesia. Yeah. From the Jakarta and then go to the province and then goes to local government and then goes to the sub-district and then goes to the village level and sub-village level until to the hamlet level. There is a long process of bureaucracy in Indonesia. This kind of things can attract more problem of elite capture. So someone or group of people that already understand, they have knowledge of certain kind of things, they try to manipulate. They try to get benefit from development project that is finally channeled into their own interest. So that is called elite capture. Yeah. Then the problem of institutionalism is time consuming. It really takes time to introduce something new, especially that the new thing need to be agreed, need to be reached by consensus. It takes time, especially in the context of various actors, like in a rural context. The next problem that is also found in institutional approach is about conflict. We see that because one of my research interests is on the rural context. When you introduce something to ordinary people, to the villagers, for example, there is a chance to mislead the information. Yeah? There is an opportunity that maybe something is understood incorrectly. And because of that, it could lead to the conflict, horizontal conflict between certain groups in those kind of contexts. And because of that problem, institutional approach really needs facilitator. So when you hear about the implementation of the village law and then the PKH project and then the I don't know, a human rights project and so on and so forth, obviously we need facilitator. It can be a problem because we need to guarantee, yeah, that the facilitators can be performed very good. And now I think it is very difficult to find those kind of things. The good facilitator is someone that can facilitate, yeah, equally, that can appreciate the local context and also being like local people. And those kind of things are not really easy. And that's why using facilitator in development project as a part of institutional approach is really, really hard to implement. And then finally come back that this also lead problem to the institutional application on the ground. Okay, maybe some of you concerned about example of institutionalism on the ground. So here I may be quickly listing. So whenever you go to the field and then try to research a development project, you will see that there is always a manual guideline. Yeah, or we call it buku petunjuk, yeah, as manual guideline. That is part of rules and regulation, yeah, in institutional approach. And then you will find that there should be local consensus and agreement, yeah, under the local context like we have now in Indonesia. Is like musyawarah. It is always musyawarah is always be part of the institutional approach, yeah, because when we referring back to the understanding of institution, that you will find that the informal institution is also important thing. Make sure that development project will be properly implemented. So part of institutionalism is manual guideline, yeah, and then local consensus and local context. So I think that you can easily find whenever you try to analyze a development project in Indonesia. So I think I misspelled the T1. Yeah? It should be conclusion with S. So institutionalism is a part of the World Bank main strategy. Yeah, critical observer will analyze this one and conclude this one as a politics to more deepening market. Yeah. So the way they try to more intervene in the context of local market is by establishing institution. And then the second point of conclusion, that is institutionalism is always context dependent. It means that it really depends on the context. Whenever the context is harmonious, yeah, they will enable institution to be work properly. But whenever there is a conflict on the ground that is difficult to settle, and then it will lead also to the problem of institution. And then it is used, yeah, as I said, the insulation technique. It is used as a mechanism to bypass. Bypass mean here is to not really engaging with the bureaucracy. As I said, that bureaucracy is a full of problem and also other things, the problem of governance that we found. So they try to not really engaging because they want to make it a perfect project. So they bypass this process and also administrative organization in our bureaucracy. Then the final conclusion is about bureaucratic politics. Yeah. So institution is really difficult to implement, not only because of we are in a really bad environment, but because of the tradition of bureaucratic politics, yeah, in Indonesian bureaucracy, that is leading to the more problem of institution. So in one hand, we try to establish the clear, clean institution in order to make it more better performance of development project. But on the other side, there is also a challenge. And one of the biggest challenge is bureaucratic politics. I think that is all my points in this presentation. And I hope that we will have more discussion, question and answer after this presentation. So thank you, and I returning back to the Master of Ceremony.
Okay, thank you very much for Mr. Anggun for the wonderful presentations. It is also a very new insight for me to learn about institutionalism and how institution is actually not merely seen as an organizations, but also as a set of norms and rules. And especially in Indonesian cases, as you mentioned before, that there are still sets of problems that still needs to be improved in institutional approaches. And especially in terms of long bureaucracy, it's been a really long history of and a really long problem in Indonesia. A very good point from Mr. Anggun. I hope we can take the values
Banget anjay, ngapain gue
presented
masuk?
today.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yes, Mr. Anggun, thank you very much. And for the Q&A sessions, we will conduct the Q&A sessions in the end of the agenda, sir. So it will be elaborated in the last sessions. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we proceed to the next seminar agenda. The second presentations will be delivered by Dr. Pantri Mutriana Erzakilian. Ms. Erza will be presenting the topic about global trade agreement and local dynamic in Indonesian cases, especially. And thus, I will invite Ms. Erza. Are you here with us, Ms.?
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Tias. Can you hear me clearly?
It's very audible, Ms.
Okay, thank you very much. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Erza Kilian, and as Dr. Ang has mentioned before, I'm also his colleague here at the Department of International Relations in Universitas Brawijaya. And today I'll be delivering presentation specifically about trade, since that's my area of expertise. So if Dr. Anggun was previously talking about institutions, I would probably be more touching upon regimes, so which is closely related to institutions, but not in the way specific institutions as we understand it traditionally. I'll be discussing about free trade agreements, which is actually part of a global trade regime at the moment. So with that introduction, please allow me to share my screen right now. Okay, wait. I think I've opened it, but okay. Okay, is it on the screen already?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, thank you very much. So the title of my presentation is about global trade agreements and local dynamics, specifically for the case of Indonesia. So, sorry, I'll be talking about three main topics today. I would probably start with giving a short introduction on what free trade agreements are, just to ensure that we are on the same page, since I'm not quite sure how familiar all of you are with free trade agreements. And then at the second point, I'm going to discuss about the trends and data regarding free trade agreements, both globally and regionally within Asia. And then at the last point, I will touch upon the FTA within the local context of Indonesia. I will be highlighting about three main subtopics: the ideas, ideologies, and policies of Indonesian FTA, the institutions and interests in Indonesian FTA, and then the last one would be regarding the limitations and challenges of Indonesian policies regarding its FTA. So moving on to the first topic. So first of all, apologies if some of you or many of you are already familiar with what free trade agreement is. So this is just a recap ensuring that we're on the same page. So basically, when we discuss about free trade agreements, it's an agreement between countries to eliminate trade barriers, or what we normally call as trade barriers. So trade barriers can come in various forms. The most common one is tariff. So for example, if you're trying to export into another country, they're going to impose an import tariff on your goods. So that's one type of trade barriers. But aside from tariff barriers, goods can also be subject to other barriers such as quota, regulations. For example, in the case of Indonesia, if you're trying to export some goods, for example, helmet, you need to have an SNE or Standard Nasional Indonesia to be able to sell that goods within Indonesia. And for importers outside of Indonesia, that's one kind of trade barriers. So in a way, free trade agreements is actually trying to eliminate or minimize these trade barriers. In the words, or in other words, we usually call it as liberalizing trades. So when we discuss about trade agreements, the most confusing thing is that although the terms is actually trade and specifically just about trade, it can cover anything from goods, services, e-commerce, intellectual property rights, government procurement, competition, labor, even environmental standards. What I meant to say here is that when countries are negotiating trade agreements, they basically don't just talk about goods, like for example, how to eliminate the tariff for my goods. They're basically discussing about everything. They're discussing about how goods is being produced. For example, about the labor standards upon which that goods is being produced. For example, are you using sweatshops for the goods that you're trying to export into my country? If you're using sweatshops, then my country won't be accepting your goods. And even trade agreements nowadays are becoming much more sophisticated. So for example, I put here about anti-corruption clauses. I'm going to give one example about anti-corruption clauses in free trade agreements. So if you're doing trade negotiations with countries like it's not a countries, like a group of countries such as the European Union are quite strict about the rules of their free trade agreements. So for example, they always have a chapter in those agreements about what they call trade and sustainable development chapter. So it covers not only the standards of labor, the standards of environments, but also it covers standards of sometimes corruption, anti-corruption clauses. So for example, they want to improve the condition of the country based on using trade agreements. So if Dr. Anggun previously mentioned about the use of institution, what we're actually seeing right now is actually also the use of trade agreements to, how do you say it, to reform or to reform a country, particularly the way how they manage their market and how they trade within one another. And then the third point that I would like to highlight about trade agreements is that when you read about trade agreements, it's often very confusing because you will read very multiple terminologies. So for example, the most common one you would hear would be FTA, and that's really common. That's basically most of the things that you're going to hear is that free trade agreements. But the varieties of trade agreements, aside from FTAs, you will have PTAs, preferential trading arrangements. And then you will have something called Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or the CEPA. So basically, these types, all of this, PTAs, FTAs, CEPA, all of this falls under the category of free trade agreements. Okay, despite the name not always being free trade, but all of this falls within the category of trade agreements. What separates them, though, is the fact that each of these agreements has a different degree of liberalization. So for example, for the PTA, it has a lower degree of liberalization. For example, the goods covered within PTA is usually 60 to 80 goods, for example, whereas for FTAs, you can have up to 300, 400s. And then for the CEPA, or the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, sometimes the agreement do not cover only goods, but it also covers services, competition policy, intellectual property rights, and even e-commerce. So basically, it just depends on the name, depends on the degree of liberalization. So I hope I made it pretty clear at the beginning about what I'm talking about when I'm using the term FTA, because it's quite wide. So perhaps the second question that comes to mind is that why do countries engage in FTAs? Like, what's the basic motivations for the for countries to choose discussing FTA with other countries? Well, at the left side, is the most common motivations, the economic ones. This is probably the ones that you'll be reading the most within the newspaper. For example, if you read the newspapers and then you see that Indonesia is going to be discussing or negotiating trade agreements with country A, most of the newspapers are going to cite this one. The purpose is to acquire new markets, to increase exports, to obtain cheaper goods, to create a more competitive regional markets, or for example, to not lose out from our competitors. Vietnam, for example, is our main competitors, and then other economic motivations. But the thing is, free trade agreements is not only about economic motivations. Free trade agreements is also very political. Okay, and it has a very strong underlying political and strategic motivations within FTAs. So for example, you will have countries who are going to be involved in FTAs because they intend to strengthen their alliance. They intend to strengthen their diplomatic ties or security ties. Okay. For example, previously there was one trade agreement called the, I forgot, between the European Union and the US, TTIP, Trans-Pacific, I forgot the first P, but investment and partnership. And it was called as economic NATO, meaning that it was actually done to strengthen alliance and diplomatic ties between the two regions. Okay. And then also there's an FTA with the main goals to expand political influence, to limit other countries' political influence. For example, the US is currently negotiating a new FTAs with the main goal to actually exclude China in Asia. So it has the political motivations within these FTAs as well. There are also FTAs which are signed as a way to politically signal collective position. For example, for the case of Indonesia, we have FTAs which we sign with ASEAN, with other countries as well. So for example, we have something called ASEAN-China Free Trade Area. And this is one of the FTAs which are signed as a way to politically signal that ASEAN is a collective bloc and as a way to leverage our power vis-a-vis China, of course. So this is just basically some introductions on why countries engage in FTAs. And then the last point of introduction regarding FTAs is that where countries actually negotiate FTAs. So for example, you will have three levels of FTA negotiations when you talk about FTAs. You will have one, trade negotiations at the multilateral level. Okay. The multilateral level is what I would say as the mothership of all trade agreements. I'm quoting one of Indonesia's top trade negotiators, which called the WTO as the mothership of all trade agreements. So within the WTO, all trade agreements are being negotiated. And its main characteristics is that it is non-exclusive, meaning that all countries in the world, as long as you're a member of WTO, can actually engage within the negotiations. Okay. And the negotiations within WTO is actually the standard or the template for agreements for other types of agreements. The other types of agreements are usually the free trade agreements, which are negotiated regionally or cross-regionally. Okay. What it means here is that these types of agreements are usually exclusive. Exclusive in the sense that if it is a regional one, then you need to be within that region to be able to negotiate that trade agreements. Okay. And if it's in a cross-regional ones, then you would be involved in trade negotiations which try to combine two geographical regions. So for example, here, if it's a regional free trade agreements, then we would have something like the ASEAN FTA or AFTA. Currently, AFTA is still in place, but we actually have it more at a higher level of cooperation. So we currently have ASEAN Economic Community. After AFTA, we have AEC. And for the cross-regional FTAs, you will have something like EU-ASEAN FTA, which is currently being negotiated as well. And then the last level of FTA negotiations is what we call as bilateral. So this one is also exclusive, and it's usually involving only two countries and not necessarily bordering one another. And an example of this would be the Indonesian-Australian SEPA, which has been in place, I think it was last year. So this is one example of bilateral FTAs. Okay. So what I would like to point out with my 3 slides, which seems to be really confusing, is the fact that it really is. I mean, when you're talking about free trade agreements, it really is confusing because they're using too many terms in there, they're using too many levels in there, they're using too many types in there. And if I show you this data, the next one, this is the trends in trade agreements at the global level. So this graph actually shows how many free trade agreements there is at the moment. Okay, just focus on the dark, what color is this? Like the dark purple one. Here it is almost around 300. So it's at around 300, probably, yeah, 300, maybe let's say 370 trade agreements. This is the one that is FTA that's currently in place, meaning that it's actually being enacted right now, the FTAs. Whereas this one, the light green, I think, yellowish green, which almost totals to 600, is actually the total cumulative notifications of FTA in place, meaning that this is the number of FTAs which are currently in place and is being negotiated. So if you just look at the numbers, for example, we take the higher one, 600 trade agreements. Imagine that we currently have 600 trade agreements at the moment, and there are 192 countries in the world. So if you took that on average, you would be having at least one country will have a minimum of 3 trade agreements in place. And that is assuming that all those countries have FTA, which is not always the case. WTO members is not 192. WTO members is only around 160. So if you look at this data, you can see that at the moment, at least one country will have around 4 to 5 trade agreements in place. And with that in mind, I want you to take a mental guess, just in your head. How many agreements do you think Indonesia have at the moment? How many free trade agreements do you think Indonesia has at the moment? You can start typing your answers in the chat box, and I will check it later. But just make a mental calculation of how many FTAs do you think Indonesia has at the moment? Okay, and then if we look at the next data, this is the distribution of free trade agreements based on the region. So you can see here, for example, this at the top one is the Caribbean region, and then at the lowest one is the European region. So you can see here that Europe has the highest number of free trade agreements. It has more than 150 free trade agreements at the moment, which sort of makes sense because Europe is probably one of the most liberalized economy at the moment, and also that the European Union is quite active in terms of the trade negotiations. And then the second most active region is actually East Asia. In here, if you look at the data, we don't have specific data for Southeast Asia. So Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries would fall within this East Asian category. So basically, we are the second most active region in terms of FTA after European Union, after Europe in terms. Okay. So with that introduction and with that data in mind, I will now move on to the case of Indonesia and how FTA dynamics works in Indonesia. Okay. So I'll check, give me time to check the chat, and then if you already have the numbers in your head about how you think how many FTAs Indonesia have at the moment, now it's time to reveal the answer. Okay, I would like to check 50 FTA. Okay, 95. Okay, that's quite. Okay, I will have 2 answers here: 50 FTAs and 95. Okay, we'll check the answers now. So basically, if you look at the data for Indonesia, Indonesia currently has 41 FTAs. Okay, 51 FTAs, but this is also classified into or categorized into different categories. So out of these 41 FTAs, 15 FTAs are already signed and in place. 3 FTAs have been signed but not yet in effect. 6 FTAs are being negotiated, and 17 FTAs are currently being studied or proposed, which means that they're going to start negotiating and sometime in the future. So if you look at this number, this is actually an interesting number because if you compare it to other countries within Asia, the highest number of FTAs is still recorded by China. The second one, I think, is by India. The third one is by South Korea, and then the fourth one is by Indonesia. Okay, I'm not sure if you know this already. I mean, but I'm not sure if you're familiar and you know that we're actually one of the most active country in terms of FTA. But this is the thing that I'm going to highlight perhaps the most, because the thing is, in FTA, as if the negotiation of FTA is always influenced by ideas, ideologies, and what is considered as correct at the moment within the country. And this is sort of a contradiction in Indonesia, because in Indonesia, you will see that there's always a debate between whether we should be much more protectionist of our economy or we should be much more liberalized in our economy. If you just look at the data on the FTA, you can see that we're quite liberalized. Okay, but the rhetorics within the country is actually the opposite. Okay, so there's always a rhetoric about economic nationalism, that we should actually use more domestic products, that we should actually promote our export and stuff like that. So, but this is also not just this is not just a show of how our community thinks about trade and stuff, but also how our government thinks about trade and stuff. Because if you look at the institutions who are involved in trade negotiations in Indonesia, you will see that there are various actors in there. The core actors in FTA Indonesia is basically the Ministry of Trade, who is actually doing the actual negotiation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who in various cases are the ones who decide who we negotiate with. And then you will have the private sectors, of course. You will have the Kadin, or Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. And then you will have private lobbyists. Private lobbyists can come in any form. Private lobbyists can either be, how do I put this delicately? It can either be a company who hire private lobbyists when they know that free trade negotiations are going to start, or it can also be government officials who act unofficially as a lobbyist for their own company. Okay, I hope that's delicate enough. But I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. And within these actors, there's different interests. Some of them wants to be a bit more protectionist. Some of them wants to be a bit liberalized. So there's always a tension, and there's always a conflict within this sphere. And then within the peripheral actors itself, you will have the legislative bodies, for example, because any free trade agreements in Indonesia will require ratifications by the legislative body. And in that sense, if the legislative body did not approve of the free trade agreements, then it's not going to be enacted in Indonesia. But historically, there has never been a case where the legislative body rejected the FTA agreements that has been signed by Indonesia. So, well, they're almost always on the same page anyway. And then there are also NGOs there. But the problem with NGOs is that NGOs are rarely involved in trade negotiations. Okay, if you want to look at NGOs as the representation of civil societies, then this is actually a good representation of Indonesia, because I'm not sure. I did my research on trade negotiations and FTAs, and I found out that most people don't understand what FTA is, or at the least form is they care about what FTA is, whereas it's actually happening next to us. One prime example that I remember vividly in my memory was that in 2010, after the Asian-China Free Trade Area was signed and enacted in 2010, 2 weeks after that, I went to the supermarket. And then I look at the shelf that used to be filled with toys from Indonesia. I just like randomly checked there, and then all the toys there were actually made from China. And I was like, wow, I was like really amazed that just within 2 weeks, the supermarket that I used to visit, it's actually already filled with goods from China. And it's something that seems to be far from us. Free trade agreements is something that seems to be really far from us, but it's actually affecting our lives, in our daily lives. You can just check the supermarket and you'll see it. So to conclude my presentation for today, I would like to highlight some limitations and some challenges of FTA implementation in Indonesia. So there are 4 that I highlight here. The first one is that there's a low level of FTA utilization in Indonesia. So what it means here is that, yes, we do have like 15 FTA in place, But the problem is, even if it's in place, not much people are using it. Not much private sectors are using it. FTA utilization, they actually have a measurement to do that. It's called PUR, preference utilization rate. And the preference utilization rate for Indonesian FTAs on average is roughly about 20 to 30%, meaning that 70 to 80% of our private sector is not using trade agreements, which bears the question of why do we negotiate free trade agreements in the first place if no one is going to use it anyway? And then the second one is the problem of transparency and public scrutiny. There is rarely any transparency and scrutiny about free trade agreements in Indonesia. It relates to what I said earlier about free trade agreements are often considered as something outside of our daily lives. We just see it as something exclusive done by the ministry or done by the trade or something exclusive trade like that, but which in reality is actually really close to us. And this is why they can actually negotiate without any much questioning from the public, without the NGOs being involved. And this also relates to the third limitations, which is the limited participation from the civil society. Because legally, our regulations regarding trade negotiations does not imply that the public needs to be included in there. So we have PEPRES, presidential decree regarding trade negotiations, and there are only 21 institutions involved there. None of them is from civil society. So that's one of the problems that I think needs to be fixed within the Indonesian case, because FTA is not just affecting private sectors, it's practically affecting everyone. But without strong legal basis, there's no way that we can actually influence the FTA dynamics in Indonesia. And then the last one, the problems with Indonesia is that we lack clear and coherent FTA strategy. So I tried asking this during my research, like, do we have some sort of blueprints of which country we're going to do trade negotiations with? And the answer is no. So Indonesia is a very reactive country in terms of FTA, reactive in terms of who offers us an FTA, we're going to say yes anyway. So we're never the one who actually approach another country and then says that, okay, since you're quite prospective for us, why don't we start negotiating FTAs? But no, Indonesia, we lack definitive, clear, and coherent FTA strategy. So sometimes if you look at Indonesian FTA, you're going to be rather amazed because, for example, we have an FTA with Mozambique, which in economic terms would be which makes more sense to have an FTA with Nigeria, for example, rather than Mozambique. But yeah, without a clear and coherent FTA strategy, it's unlikely that we can actually make use of this FTA strategically, both politically and economically. So I think that kind of sum up my presentation for today. Apologies if I tend to speak too fast. And I'll be open for any questions or discussion if you have at the end of the session. So thank you very much. And I will give the floor back to the MC, Ms. Diaz.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful insight for Ms. Erza for today. Let me recap the topic from Ms. Erza. First of all, about free trade agreement among countries. Then we also discuss about why countries engage in FTA that drive from economic motivations and political motivations. This phenomena also happen in the dynamics of FTA in Indonesia. Okay, before we go to the last session for last topic today, while we're waiting for our last speaker to join with us, so we move to the discussion session first. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have come to an almost edge of this agenda. I encourage to all participants if any of you want to raise a questions for our distinguished speaker regarding the first, second, and third topic, you can guys can ask your questions via chat box if you cannot speak directly, or you can ask your question by raise hand to ask directly to the speakers.
Okay, can I jump in for a second? Just before we start discussion, I think my colleague should be introduced properly, which is now. Yeah, so Ibu Erza was a graduate from University of Pajajaran, International Relations Department, and then she did her master in Queensland University, Australia, and she did her PhD at Leeds University. Yeah? So I think you forgot to mention her CV. Yeah? Okay, so I'm ready now for discussion.
Okay, thank you. I just got a reply from Prof. Bulbul that she's just reaching at home and will join after 10 minutes. Before we continue to Bulbul sessions, I would like to ask something to the board speakers. Previously, we were discussing about the role of Indonesia in global political economy. And we come to understand that from the practitioner, from Dr. Muhammad Koyum, he was addressing that Indonesian status in the global political economy has been stated by him as a participant. We cannot say that Indonesia has a role, but we are only the participant of global political economy in the region. We take an example like, for example, since 1955 to today, the role of Indonesia has been up and down. I mean that there has been an increase in the time of Suharto. We are leading in the Southeast Asia. But after that, during the post-Reformation era, we are declining in our economy, and it makes us only becoming as the global producer of raw material. I mean, the Indonesian economy is only extractive, as we only produce crude palm oil, we only produce minerals for making for consumption of energy, and etc. etc. We have no certain added points in technology, and every new technology has not been announced the Indonesian economy. What is the feedback from Miss Erza or Mr. Anggun?
Can I have a quick response to your question? And then
Yes.
to Erza. Yeah. Maybe I'll take it seriously the word participant here. Maybe in my word, it's not only participants, but Indonesia is becoming target. So why is that? If you consider the number of populations, when you're talking about the economic development, and then we have 250 million people, or more, maybe over than that, more than that numbers. Imagine that you have a population, hundreds of millions people, and then you produce goods and services. So how much benefit that you can get from that? So it is not only participant, but now we are a target of economic deepening. Yeah? So if I may borrowing the word by Toby Carroll, he said that the attention to deepening market, not only enlarging market, but also deepening market. So I think he is quite correct when he touched upon the type of leadership. Yeah. In the past, we had a new order regime that was pretty much quite organized, quote unquote. and took a role in at least in Southeast Asia. Yeah. But then we had a reformation era in 2001. Then it was suddenly everything is collapsed. So I think the role of Indonesian market is now not really strong. I think, yeah, as I say, we participate, of course, in some degrees of agreement, as Bu Ersa said. But yes, I think I quite agree with his statement about this one. But the problem is not only that, and the question is more critical than that. So how we can escape from this situation? How we can regain our position, at least in Southeast Asia, broadly speaking, in East Asia, with these kind of things. Yeah. We are not really get into the high perform of economic development in the last 10 years. I think the statistic is quite showing that we are not really impressive despite the pandemic. But yes, I think we need to have a, let's say, it's a global strategy. How to get the situation better, and how to deal with those problems, and so on and so on. So I think my basic answer of that question is, now we are not really exploited, yeah. But of course we are participants, yes, and for me, we are now a target of economic development, market development. I pass on to Erza.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anggun and Mr. Habib, for the questions. So my straightforward answer for that question, or for that comment, is it really depends. So some of it I agree. For example, in terms of you were discussing about global value chain, specifically discussing about the role of Indonesia within the production structure, in terms that we don't actually have, we're not really highly involved within the global chain structure. We're only providers of raw materials. At that point, yes, I do agree. At some point, we haven't really actually been able to level up our economic status as a producer of raw materials, and we're still struggling to do that. And if actually you look at the rhetorics of our government when they're doing FTAs, that's what basically they're always saying. They're always saying that we're doing FTA is actually so we can actually be involved within the larger part of the global value chain, which is yet to see. It's going to take about 10 to 20 years. So for that point, yes, I would have to agree. But on the other hand, the word participant here would have a very different meaning if we were talking about economic governance. Okay. So for example, economic governance here, in this sense, refers to our role in actually giving voice or representing voice of not just Indonesia, but other countries as well. So for example, there has been several previous studies. One of the latest one is from Dr. Faisal Karim. I think he's a university lecturer at Binus University. He mentioned that Indonesia was actually a middle power. So if you're doing international relations, you'd probably be familiar that there's a structure within the international system. There are superpowers, there are great powers, small powers, and there's something called middle powers. So Indonesia is considered as middle powers, and we are middle powers in WTO, where we often act as Dr. Faisal Karim mentioned is as bridge builder. Bridge builder in the sense that we are actually connecting between the developing world and then the developed world. For example, we are actually the head of Group 33 in WTO. So in that sense, we actually have not just a role as specifically just participant in terms of economic governance, but we also have a growing role to become a mediator for some aspects of economics. Another example would be the one that the presidency that we're holding right now, the G20 presidency. We're faced for like 20 largest GDP groups, and we're currently the president of G20. So although I'm quite skeptics about G20, I have to say that it's not like I'm a promoter of G20. No, I'm skeptics about G20. But the fact that we do have roles in these organizations, in WTO, in G20, and then we're invited to several other economic forums, means that it's not just being a participant. In global value chains, yes, participant, but in economic governance, we're actually slowly building up our role, either as mediator, either as bridge builder, and sometimes the voice of the developing countries in that sense. Of course, in addition to other middle power as well, emerging middle powers such as China or India. So my short answer for that question would be yes and no, depending on the issues. Because when you talk about global political economy, you would have different structure. You would have production structure, you would have the finance structure, investment structure, governance and stuff. So it really depends on which area you're talking about. So I think that's my additional answer. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the great explanation from each speaker regarding to first question from Mr. Habibie questions. I would like to thank you very much for Mr. Anggun that have additional information about Ms. Erza background before. I'm so sorry because I don't explain about Ms. Erza before because Ms. Erza start the presentation directly before I explain the detailed background. But anyway, thank you for Mr. Anggun to explain Ms. Erza background that have a wonderful academic qualifications from PhD program at University of Leeds and Master of International Economics and Finance at University of Queensland. Ms. Erza also have expertise about trade and economic diplomacy, regionalism, diplomacy and international negotiations, and politics of global business. So we have grateful speakers for today, right? Okay, now let's move to the last topic for today. The last presentation will be delivered by Dr. Bulbul Dar James from the Faculty of Political Science in Jamia Millia Islamia. Ms. Bulbul have academic qualification PhD program at University of London as a Commonwealth Scholar about politics of economic liberalization in urban Tanzania. Ms. Bulbul also have expertise about research, publications, and presentation about gender and empowerment, political economy and governance, human rights, and African studies. Professor Bulbul Dar James will be bringing the topic regarding international financial institution, IMF, World Bank, WTO, GATT, and its impact. Hello, Ms. Bulbul, are you here with us?
Yes, I am.
How are you?
I got the mic on? Yes. Yes. Apologies. Firstly, apologies. And I think I missed some great sessions before this. So huge apologies. I'm just rushing in and quickly getting my act together. And I will not cover WTO. I think it's been covered by the initial speaker. So we will go over an overview of financial institutions at large. And I think you've been specific about Indonesia, which is something I really missed. I should have been there in the presentations, and I really wanted to, but apologies once again.
Okay, that's okay, Ms. Bulbul. So, Ms. Bulbul, if I'm not wrong, are you currently in India right now?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
I'm in
wow.
a place called Gurgaon, which is outside of Delhi. So that's where I stay. So I've just, I'm sorry I had to go to the hospital to take my mother. And I've just kind of got back, getting my act together.
Wow, that's so great. We are greeting you from Indonesia. Okay, thus
Yes.
we invite all
Namaskar.
the distinguished speaker and the moderator to come to the stage. Without any further ado, you can start your presentation from now on. The floor is yours.
Okay. Is that visible? Is that visible? Because I'm not sure what you can see. Is the title slide visible?
Yes, madam, it's very possible.
So I just wanted to quickly do a backdrop because we have such an exclusive kind of a August gathering here, along with people who took the session earlier. And so I would like to put it in perspective, in the larger perspective. And of course, you've done it in Indonesian perspective. So essentially, today's theme would have been, I would have done the background of feminist economics, but I'll see if we have the time. I think I'm going to do that the next time and end with it, because that's something that doesn't come in the purview of how we are looking at gender at all. So I'm a little concerned that we're missing out on a whole dynamic there where it's not being considered. But basically, I'm going to start with setting the stage, the historical background of the Cold War, the political differences, and why the reason for the institutions and what they are today, essentially. And the background, of course, the focus, of course, would be on certain areas where Marshall Plan, Washington Consensus, and others would be looked at. And in contemporary perspective, how are we placing that? The previous lectures that we've covered has been on perspectives of political economy, liberalization, liberalism, nationalism, Marxism, to put it broadly, where we, even Gilpin, who's kind of propagated the conceptual framework for a liberal kind of a notion of global political economy, believes and reiterates that the world today is described by ideas of economic nationalism and occasionally by Marxism as well. But relevant are these three perspectives. And of course, their relationship of these perspectives, their relationship to the state market and civil society, which we've done extensively. Historically, when we look at the Cold War and its alliances structures, which provided the framework for the international financial institutions that we would be looking at. Along with it, of course, the security concerns and the alliances, which kind of provided like a political glue. And then, of course, you had the end of the Cold War, post-war, and we will look at the post-war scenario because we look at the origin of these institutions and how they came in, and the American leadership and the close capitalist, kind of cooperation, which has over a period of time, reduced and led to economic liberalization. The last time we did multinational corporations and transnational corporations, and the theoretical background behind those in terms of financial theory, when we were, putting it into perspective, when we were looking at economic globalization, it entailed a few key areas of development in trade, in finance, in foreign direct investments by the multinational corporations. So you had international trade, which has grown more rapidly than global economic output in a lot of ways. Merchandise trade, which is in goods and in services as in banking, information, etc., has significantly increased as well. And with the decreasing cost of transportation, more and more goods are becoming tradable. So we have other areas, and IPR, is a very significant concern at this point in time. And of course, the increased kind of competition that we are looking at. So the expansion of the entire trade, global trade, was in terms of a number of developments post-war, where we are looking at trade barriers which declined significantly due to successive rounds of trade negotiations. And during the last half of the 20th century, the average tariff, of levels of United States and other industrialized countries has dropped from about 40% to 6%. And barriers to trade in services has also been lowered considerably. So in addition to this, in the 1970s, we're looking at deregulation and privatization, further opening up the national economies to imports which came in. So technological advances have also meant communications and transportation has reduced the costs considerably, and thus significantly encouraging trade expansion. So trade is a major area, which I'm sure the previous speaker would have covered in, having done WTO and other areas. So taking advantage of these kind of economic and technological changes, more and more businesses have participated in international markets as well. But nonetheless, despite these developments, most trade takes place amongst, the advanced industrialized economies, United States, Western Europe, Japan, plus a few other emerging East Asian, Latin American, and elsewhere to begin with. most of the less developed world now has come up in a big way, except as have ordinarily been exporters of food and raw material. But it is estimated, for example, in a lot of ways that some of the continents like Africa, especially, countries south of Sahara, have only about 1% of the trade, which today has increased, but not exponentially as other places have. So we are looking at this kind of a financial revolution, which has linked national economies closely to one another. Increased capital is available for the developing countries because of the short-term financial flows. High volatile kind of and speculative trade has happened, and flows are happening. International finance has become the most unstable aspect of the global capitalist system today. And we'll end with, the notion of where we are, because the concluding kind of session we are going to do in a comparative way. So the government's becoming more vulnerable to sudden shifts in and movements. In these movements, they can, and they easily fall prey to currency speculations. For example, 1992 economic financial crisis and others. So we have this whole notion of multinational corporations and transnational cooperations, and the stages of growth in which they have evolved has been, tremendous in terms of international trade per se, portfolio investment, and FDIs. FDIs comes up when we look at other notions as well. And basically this investment has over the years proved to be financially and otherwise so much more viable for these organizations because of the market phenomena, which is a third angle in the triad of the state, civil society, and the market that we are looking at. So getting a better feel of the market, having, a strategy which is diversifying, following the competitor as we did the last time, and all the three, academic theories concerning, decisions of these kind of corporations to actually invest abroad is the three theories that we spoke about: the financial life cycle and market imperfection. And of course, the financial theory is simply increasing the net cash flows and reducing the risk in a lot of ways. So maximizing your assets. And we've done this, so I don't want to repeat that. And life cycle, a lot of this is part of the way we look at the financial institutions, because they are actually operationalizing a lot of these dimensions too. Then, of course, the life cycle, theory of the corporations like multinational and transnational coming in terms of simply, unlike the financial theories, the product of the life cycles theories focuses on FDIs completely. And these theories consider investments as a bona fide management strategy. So, there's a backdrop to that, aimed at overcoming market saturation of products. So you could market when the market matures. So market is a very dynamic kind of a phenomena in a lot of ways in the era in which we are. And political economy, the politics of the market, the political economy of the market has a lot of back and forth that we are looking at. So this, in fact, life cycle theory projects this as a typical product development process, where the product goes through the phases of, introducing the product, pioneering element, to expansioning, to the expansion of the growth of the product itself, to stabilization and the maturation of the product, and finally to decline, so that you move on to maybe another product when you're looking at. The market imperfection theories essentially look at the monopolistic advantage which is there. And we need to link all these with the IFI, with the international financial institutions, when we are looking at the larger perspective, the macro perspective of, for instance, placing Indonesia in the world economy, or India in the world economy, or what have you. And so there's an exploitation of a monopolistic and an oligopolistic advantage by reaching out into the world market, which these organizations, which these corporations do, and the way the production advantage that are due, the good R&D, the research and development of the product, the process technology are due to superior kind of R&D that exists. And then you have, of course, the within the firm dynamic that happens, maybe members of the same family and stuff like that. And finally, you have the advantage of control of certain knowledge and intensive high technology products and processes, which is like it provides a safe and a sure way of maintaining your own monopoly over the products itself. So all of these kind of led to a whole, origin of a notion of financial globalization, which exemplified the healthy and the beneficial triumph of the economic capital of the global capitalism, which is what the phase that we're in from one perspective. And from another perspective, the international financial system is today out of control. It's something which must be regulated. It needs these kind of imperatives to do. So the background to the financial institutions, of course, the origin is the Cold War. After being the allies during the World War II, the US and USSR soon viewed each other with a lot of skepticism and suspicion. And this kind of political differences created an icy climate. And that plunged the two countries into an era of bitter rivalry, which we are, of course, calling the Cold War. And the political differences became magnified, and this bipolarity of, USSR and USA, of course, as you've done in international politics, but we need to trace that, especially today, to the crisis and the Ukraine war that we're looking at, and that's why we need to know the background there as well. At the heart of the tension were, of course, from the American perspective, fundamental differences in political systems. America claims to be a democracy that has a capitalist economic system, free elections ostensibly, and competing political parties. USSR, it was accused of being the sole political party. The communists established what Americans in an Americocentric and a Eurocentric way was called the totalitarian systems and regimes with little or no rights for the citizens. So with this kind of suspicion of Eastern Europe, suspicions which were developed during the wars, even during the wars, despite an allied kind of a notion that two nations disagreed on a lot of things. When Stalin became an ally of Hitler, for instance, this was something which is a carryover which was taken up. And Stalin, on his part, was upset with US, which had kept the development of the atomic bomb a secret. So, there's a lot of back and forth in the way the development has happened, in this world scenario, where the political economy of it becomes so significant, because that's where we're looking at the cost-benefit analysis. In the midst of all this, you had the United Nations, which came up, where hopes for a world peace were high at the end of the war. And the most visible symbol of this was the United Nations. But of course, whatever we might say, United Nations doesn't have teeth. So even today, when you're approaching the UN institutions, it is with an expectation of something to happen and negotiation to happen, but it really doesn't work in that way. And unfortunately, the UN soon has, over a period of time, has become a forum for competing superpowers to spread their influence over others. So, it's that ideological kind of an era where, the backdrop can be is kind of perceived as a power dynamic there as well. So with the Soviets dominating Eastern Europe, Soviet Union had suffered huge losses, 20 million in World War II. deaths, half of whom were civilians. So it was a major kind of a debilitating thing. As a result, and this is from the Soviet perspective, as a result, they felt justified in their claim to Eastern Europe. They said, this is something that we claim, and this is something even now Putin, when you're looking at the whole dynamic of why he attacked Ukraine, becomes something which is significantly expansionist designs of the NATO that he was protesting about. So furthermore, Soviet Union and its allies and Eastern Europe, they felt that they needed Eastern Europe as a buffer against the future German kind of aggression, which they were anticipating. So you had a Western theoretical perspective is that Stalin installed puppet governments elsewhere, and satellite, in other words, satellite communist governments in Eastern European countries like Albania, like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and what have you. So this after promising free elections. So for Eastern Europe in the Yalta conference. So it's become, all these conferences are yardstick of the diversions in the ideologies, which over a period of time really don't exist. So we are, kind of looking at this Europe after the World War and the kind of influences that were there. You can see the kind of polarization that happened, which really, where US was also establishing a policy of containment, faced with this kind of Soviet threat. Truman actually decided that it was time to stop kind of mollycoddling Soviet Union. And by 46, you had George Kennan, actually an American diplomat, and I'm sure you've done that in international relations, who actually, who was in Moscow, who proposed a policy of containment. He said this should be, communism needs to be contained. So containment meant that United States of America would prevent any further extension of communist rule. So we can see the logic of the Ukraine war here today itself in this kind of a containment policy that, perhaps was established. And further to that, of course, you had Churchill's whole concept of the Iron Curtain across Europe, where Europe was divided into two political regions, as was clear, mostly democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. So in his 1946 speech, Churchill actually said that an iron curtain has descended across the continent, between, it's like a bar between the two. And the phrase Iron Curtain really came to stand for the division of Europe, that Europe was, today divided. So you had all kinds of So you had all kinds of caricatures also which came up at that point in time about how this, the Iron Curtain was something which need to be drawn also. And then the Truman Doctrine simultaneously, which was the American policy of containment, soon expanded into a policy known as the Truman Doctrine. And this doctrine first was used in Greece, then in Turkey, and in the late 1940s, it vowed that it's going to provide like aid in terms of money and the military supplies to support what they call the free people. So already these schisms were becoming broader, and people who were resisting outside pressures. So we can see, and why I'm doing this is to set the stage for the I'm sorry, somebody saying something, Habibi or anybody? Okay. So by 1950s, the US had given about nearly $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. And it was no small sum at that point in time. And it's in the light of this that, we see the Marshall Plan coming into being. And And what was the Marshall Plan? It was post 1948, President Truman signed the Economic Recovery Act of 1948. And this became known as the Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who in 1947 kind of pronounced that the United States provides economic assistance to restore the economic infrastructure of post-war Europe. So there was a defense there. This was instituted, US instituted it in 1948, and that primarily filled the role and that the World Bank went on to focus later on other areas, particularly economic development of poorer countries. So this was the backdrop to which, it was being looked at. The Marshall Plan, of course, was an American initiative enacted in 1948 to provide foreign aid to Western Europe. Essentially, that was it. US transferred over 13 billion dollars in economic recovery programs to Western European economies after the World War. So the plan initially was what it was seeking to do was that the post-war devastated, economically devastated nations would be addressed. And this was proposed as a package to European nations. Western Europe accepted the help, while Eastern Europe resisted. And in fact, Stalin rejected it completely. So over the next 4 years, 16 European countries received about 13 billion in US aid. And by 1952, Western Europe's economy was flourishing. So they had developed this whole, the niche area of, Western Europe. And the whole design, the way it was, Marshall Plan was designed was, targeting all these countries to get them all together as part of the larger picture. But a lot of caricatures at that point actually questioned whether the Marshall Plan, whether the package of Marshall Plan would land where it was intended to do as well, because the idea was to cut down on, the Eastern Bloc. And that's when we see the Bretton Woods systems coming into the picture, where completely created by the US Treasury, which was responsible for convening this Bretton Woods conference, which took place because they believed that it was currency and trade wars of the early 1990s that spread the Great Depression globally and created the environment for misery and anger that paved the way to war. So they said, we had to do away with war. Sorry. So they were determined to stamp out economic aggression in post-war landscape by creating two institutions, which is what we are looking at today, which they believed would stop the countries to, from resorting to what they said was destructive measures. And what were the destructive measures that they were perceiving? The destructive measures were trade protectionism, supposedly destructive, and competitive devaluation, along with something that they envisaged would lead to better cooperation. Now, I don't know how, this came about in Indonesia. I'm sure you did that just now. But basically, you had the two major institutions which came in as an outcome of what was considered destructive measures by the US Treasury. In vogue to have measures like trade protectionism and competitive devaluation questioned and seized. So both were created at this international conference, and you had a notion of this whole the whole US agenda of supremacy was kind of projected, and because US contributed most of the capital, as a consequence for the creation, as a consequence of it, it had most votes. It also was the only country that had the veto power over policy changes within the organizations. So in keeping with that, you had really the development of the Bretton Woods institutions of IMF and World Bank. IMF, of course, was created to preside over a whole segment of new fixed exchange rate. So these were more short-term measures. And we've done this as part of structural adjustment in our first few lectures and stabilization measures. And it was stabilization measures that, you know, were propagated by World Bank, but we'll come to that when we, you know, again, look at placing Washington consensus in the contemporary times. So you have IMF created this new fixed exchange rate based on the US dollar. Countries with temporary balance of payment deficits would be able to borrow with a high rate cost there from IMF on what they call concessional terms. But these concessional terms became something which later aid became tied to when, you know, they couldn't pay back the loans. The IMF itself found that it was taking a different role after the collapse of the fixed exchange rate. So international crisis, much before, you know, became frequent after 1980s, which is when we are looking at economic liberalization taking place, when we look at contemporary notion of globalization in the form of economic liberalization, where IMF was able to clearly reinvent itself as the international firefighter. That from what its role was earlier, you know, subjugating others, it became something which was so similar. So the World Bank, of course, was established initially in order to assist the reconstruction of Europe after the war. It was also called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, all of which created in the Bretton Woods system. And you can see the entire edifice that was the backdrop of it was, of course, the Marshall Plan that was thinking this through and essentially leading up to the supremacy of what was considered liberty in that sense of the term. And in other words, supremacy of the US, where you were looking at American aid being something so predominant that, you know, you were trying to, everybody was trying to acquire it in some sense of the term. There were different representations of this, and this is something that was projected and taught in a lot of, you know, as text as well, and it was also seen as you know, teaching Cold War at that point in time, used, you know, similes like the cow being milked from all sides as part of this whole syndrome of, you know, how we were perceiving aid being given, or the fact of these international financial institutions being in place in that sense of the term. And in keeping with that, of course, you had broadly, IMF was for the global monetary system and to maintain that monetary system. And as I told you earlier, more for stabilization measures rather than long-term ones. So microeconomic measures, economic stability with a single organization in place, and, you know, credit lines that were there. Initially, it had what were called SDRs, which was special drawing rights, which was a basket currency of 5 currencies. And the only, you can see, as you can see, the only Asian currency was the yen, the Japanese yen. Otherwise, it was predominated by Western Europe. You know, you had German Deutschmark, you had the pound sterling of the UK, you had the French franc, and of course, the US dollar. With that basket currency, the negotiating grounds for economic liberalization were put in place for any kind of aid that was given, because clearly IMF said that we are a monetary organization, we are a monetary fund, we are not an aid giving organization. World Bank, on the other hand, was established to finance, ostensibly to finance and advise developing countries. And economic growth had major institutions as part of it. Two major institutions within it were IBRD, as we said, how it came up, which was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the International Development Association, the IDA. And so the IMF provided assistance to deal with issues related to financial sector and macroeconomics, whereas World Bank basically facilitated lending to lessen power, to decrease poverty and promote long-term development of the economy. So it's stabilization versus structural adjustment when we look at IMF and the World Bank in place. And it becomes significant when we are kind of visualizing that in the year that it was founded, the IMF, in 1944, based in Washington, DC, the IMF is an autonomous kind of a body, which has begun its operations in 1947 only. And from its inception, the member countries were initially 31, leading up to 188 countries. So the fund is like a unitary organization affiliated to the United Nations organization. It also supposed to provide concessional and non-concessional lending to its member countries. The member nations often contribute to kind of finance the operations in a lot of ways. And that's when we see that there's a fixed quota, which is decided according to the national income and the international trade. The quota is taken as a base to determine, the borrowing rights and the voting power. And as we already told you, voting rights were tremendous in terms of, the way the IMF saw that in perspective. Initially, with the US having the supremacy of it. So it kind of oversees, the function of IMF in terms of international monetary system being the primary focus to bring financial stability, to encourage world trade. So they're all related to, the financial institutions become linked to WTO as well, GATT at that point in time. Reduce poverty, which is a minor kind of a function, generate employment, because they feel that once you're investing and once you're giving, giving loans of that sort, it will stimulate the sustainable growth of the economy at large. It's interesting that by 2012, the area of operation of IMF is extended, and it now oversaw matters related to macroeconomic and finance. It oversaw stability of the world's monetary system, while the World Bank was aiming to reduce poverty by offering assistance to middle income and low income countries. So in its mission itself, the IMF monitors economic activities. It clearly says that it offers members certain policy making tools and analysis, and also provides loan to the member countries. So what are the kind of policy making tools it's provided post liberalization? We've done this before. Anybody has an answer to that in terms of what IMF has provided as a yardstick? We're going to take this up when we finish, because the questions have to come the other way also. I see a lot of distraction, so we need to focus on this. The IMF, to maintain its mission, monitors economic activity and offers members policy making tools and analysis. And these tools have been used, misused, abused in a lot of ways, and which is what I'm asking you about instances about. World Bank, on the other hand, accomplishes its goals through technical and financial kind of support that enables countries to implement specific projects, like building health centers, making clean water. So it's trying to tie up, development initiatives with, loans that are given. So because poverty alleviation, or international, as it's called, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, so that kind of elements is brought in a lot of ways. So you have projects on, joint forestry management, on clean water harvesting, on, sustainable technologies and technologies which are, that's something which over a period of time, it's come into being. So the purpose of World Bank, contrary to IMF, which is short-term microeconomic measures, is long-term economic development and poverty reduction in economically developed countries. How? By making technical and financial support available. So the bank initially focused on rebuilding infrastructure. As we said, it was IBRD to begin with in Western Europe. Following World War II, it has then turned its operational focus to underdeveloped countries. And this is in vogue to support and get, its sphere of, to increase its sphere of influence in a lot of ways that, one can perceive how that's going to happen. And essentially, the support to the country's reform process, inefficient economic sectors which might be there, implement specific projects like, specifically to end poverty. In fact, the 2030 goal of World Bank is to end poverty by decreasing how many people live on less than $1.90 a day. That's less than $2 a day, and promote a kind of a shared prosperity through income growth for the lowest 40% of each country that, one is looking at. And the measures, of course, the different kind of, within the World Bank, the different organizations that are there are IBRD, as we already say, which is really, the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and lends to middle income and credit-worthy low-income countries, governments. And there are 189 members of this branch in the World Bank that you have. And the International Development Association offers interest-free, and it's another organization within it, offers interest-free loans and grants to the world's poorest countries. Now, these are all ways of actually increasing your sphere of influence as well. And the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, really is also similarly is a kind of, propagating finances and investment and capital mobilization, giving advisory services to businesses and governments in economically developing countries. So the World Bank is, the wings and the way it is spreading is the sphere of influence in myriad ways that, we can perceive. And finally, you have the, before that, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency within the World Bank promotes foreign direct investment in economically developing countries. And then the International Center for Settlement of Investment and Disputes, a lot like WTO, because the previous speaker has done WTO with you. You will have, because a dispute settlement mechanism of WTO is very similar. It provides kind of investment dispute conciliation. This one provides, International Center for Settlement of Investment and Disputes provides dispute, investment dispute conciliation and arbitration. And the focus of World Bank assistance is typically long-term, funded by countries, mainly the world's richest countries that are members of the bank, through issuing of bonds. The bank's loans are not used as a type of a bailout, that is clear, as in the case with IMF, because IMF is clearly the loan, and we see that in the structural adjustment programs that were later propagated by the World Bank, and we see that in the stabilization measures that IMF loan was like a bailout that was given. But World Bank ones are like a fund for projects that help to develop an underdeveloped economy or an emerging market nation and making it more productive economically. So we have the whole phenomena of the development, the way it is emerging in a way that the IMF and World Bank have made themselves indispensable in this kind of a scenario. And let's face it, what happens and how we look at the loan that's given is that who is giving the loan, where the funding is coming from, that also decides the kind of development that is taking place. So in science and technology, for instance, what is important to study scientifically would be determined by the loan that you would get. If you don't have the resources, how do you fund, or how do you, move forward in that kind of a scenario? So you have, that whole phenomena of, making a difference in that sense of the term. And the backdrop of this was, of course, the Washington Consensus, and which was in the 1980s, of the change, in the financial institutions that we are seeing, that what provided the impetus for the current economic liberalization to take place was the Washington Consensus, which was really looking at, this was a set of 10 economic policy prescriptions, which were standard kind of prescriptions, reform packages. It was a reform package promoted for economic crisis-driven countries. So the notion became that the IMF and the World Bank were, as part of, along with the US Department of Treasury, were to really bring forth a change in these countries and uplift them from crisis that was there. And I'm sure you've done this as part of your crisis, and previous speakers would have done this as well. The prescriptions had a whole combination of policies in areas of macroeconomic stabilization, in economic opening with respect to both trade and with investment, and the expansion of the market forces within the domestic market at large. So the first prescription that was there was, in terms of fiscal policy discipline, with avoidance of large kind of fiscal deficits relative to the GDP. They said that you needed to have that discipline. The countries, and this was taken up later as the plan, as a part of the structural adjustment program and the stabilization measures that took place, especially the SAP, the structural adjustment program. Do you have a structural adjustment program that was introduced, and what was it called in Indonesia? Anybody? Did you have one? The MC, can you answer, or whoever took the session earlier? Post liberalization. Yeah. Okay, I think your mic, I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, Prof. Can you repeat the questions?
That did you have when IMF and World Bank loan was given with economic liberalization introduced, what was in Indonesia, what was the policy called? Did you have like a structural adjustment program there? Economic liberalization took place how?
Yes, Professor, maybe I will try to answer. Yes, we do have the economic liberalizations in Indonesia also.
Yeah, what was it like? What was it called? Was it called a structural adjustment?
The structural adjustment?
Yeah, did it mean structural adjustment?
I don't think it is sort of a structural adjustment. It's just the common liberalizations.
Okay, I'm going to ask you this question when I end the session also, because I want to distinguish between structural adjustment, which means a whole readjustment of the country's political scenario and the way it's practiced, and you have short-term stabilization measures. So I'm sure it was introduced. I just wanted to know what was it named? What they did was, this was part of policy measures. So you had fiscal policy discipline with avoidance of any kind of fiscal deficits being there relative to the GDP. Then you had redirection of public spendings. All these are structural adjustment measures, actually. Redirection of public spendings from subsidies, especially indiscriminate subsidies that were given to certain segments, the welfare state kind of subsidies, towards a broad-based provision for key growth, pro-poor services like primary education, primary health care, infrastructural investment, and others. And then you had tax reform, which, Washington Consensus focused on, where interest rates, the notion of looking at it from the perspective of, reform was broadening the tax base and adopting moderate kind of marginal tax rates. So this is all a part of the thing. And, when we've introduced GST, I don't know if you have, but before that you had other areas like mod VAT, which was introduced later. Otherwise it was VAT, just the value added tax. And then you had this modified value added tax, which was introduced in countries like UK and others, which came in, petered down to other developing countries as part of these measures as well. So basically broadening the tax base and adopting moderate kind of tax, marginal tax rates was the idea. Then interest rates, when we are looking at it, interest rates that the market determined and positive but moderate in real terms. So when we are talking about market determined interest rates, that was a change that was happening also. When you have trade liberalization towards liberalization of imports, with particular emphasis on the elimination of quantitative, restrictions like licensing. Slowly you can see what they are coming to, what they are edging towards, and open, more laissez-faire than ever before, more openness and free trade. So that, it could be truly global. And these prescriptions were imposed not on the developed world, but on the developing world, ostensibly to improve their political economy and even the society, because they were talking about changes which would be, public spending towards areas of alleviating the poor and stuff like that. So liberalization of inward kind of foreign direct investment was something that was visualized, and competitive exchange rates clearly was something that they wanted to use, because this would be their way of getting into the countries and having a kind of a relationship of which was mutually conducive, but definitely more beneficial to them than others. So the question that I'd asked you was that economic and related liberalization that took the form of, in the 80s and early 90s, that took the form of stabilization and structural adjustment, really were part of conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank imposed, and before they gave any loan. And if that was not enough, all other donor agencies, all other countries also tied their loan to the conditionalities of the IMF and World Bank. Basically, the conditionalities or the strings attached that came were of the IMF. And you had stabilization measures. Stabilization measures are in terms of balance of payments, in terms of using fiscal and monetary restraint. Stabilization could be exchange rate devaluation. It could be moving to an exchange rate which reflected relative scarcity of the foreign and domestic currency rather than not, And then, of course, more significantly, structural adjustment, which is the question I'd asked you, which are measures of market liberalization. Now, they seem that these are economic measures, but these were much more than just being economic measures, because the implications of market liberalization were such that it meant, number one, a kind of extensive range of sectoral measures which were designed to improve the supply side conditions, because these countries didn't have commodities which were available. Economic crisis was so rampant in the southern hemisphere in that sense of the term. So structural adjustment was pitched as market liberalization to improve the economies, but in the process, it changed the polity and the social implications of it. So secondly, it was to make the domestic prices correspond to the shadow prices, so that, you could see a change happening. It was to include a whole range of deregulation of products and factor markets. And then privatization, and I'm sure that's been happening there as well, privatization of the state enterprise, which on the face of it seems value neutral, but it's not. Because privatization of the state enterprise meant that you were cutting down on the government sector, you were retrenching, people found themselves unemployed, you had VRS, you had, voluntary retirement schemes, you had other measures through which the public sector was sought to be made more efficient, but in the bargain, it meant destabilizing the status quo that existed at that point in time. And the argument that the IMF and the World Bank were giving for these measures was that there's too much of corruption in these countries, that nepotism is high, and we could only correct it not by stabilization measures, but by structural adjustment measures. We had to structurally adjust the economy and in turn, the polity and the society. Sorry, is somebody saying something? Habibi?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, the program is
Going to end.
Can you make lectures not shorter, ma'am?
Sorry?
Can you briefly summarize your lectures?
Okay. So basically, okay, we're going to finish up. So basically, it also meant institutional reform, especially of the government and of the public sector, which is what it entailed. So you had notions which, through the IMF and the World Bank measures, the political economy since the last 30 years has been one of balancing, the relative strengths of the state, civil society, and the market. Globalization, which is, has led to privatization and liberalization through these measures, which have come with strings attached. And the context of this becomes even more significant because we are looking at the activities which are so generated towards economic growth, and economic growth, to put it concisely and conclude it, economic growth according to the World Bank and IMF, can only be resumed by a contraction of the state activity. The state activity cannot grow, it has to contract, and the development of a liberalized market. So that's why these become very, very significant areas. And of course, good governance was a part and parcel of this kind of significant notion, with institutional reforms thrown in and a whole lot of other measures. So, I mean, what I do want to end on is the challenges which, over a period of time have come in. You have, with 2014, you have the BRICS, which created institutions like the contingent reserve arrangement, which is a bit like the IMF. So when we are doing the international financial institutions, we can see these have evolved in regional ways, and the resource behind it is minimal. They also established the new development bank, which is a bit like the World Bank. So you have the contingent reserve arrangement that the BRICS did, which is a bit like the IMF, and new development bank, which is a bit like the World Bank. And 2015, China has initiated Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, which would focus on investments at large, and a lot of ways in which, other theorists have spoken about the way IMF is the closest thing that we have, probably, which is like an international lender of the last resort. That is declining in some senses of the term. We can just stop here. And of course, the connection to, we can just stop here. Maybe we can discuss that later, because I don't want you, just sitting through a lecture without really being able to question anything. So we'll just stop here.
Okay, that's a very wonderful session from Prof. Bulbul. From the previous questions about the trade liberalization structural adjustment programs in Indonesia, yes, we have the trade liberalization such as Omnibus Law and Investment Law. This policy is all about workers' issues, employment, investment policy, and governance administrations. So let me give you a little bit recap for you guys about Prof. Bulbul sessions. Prof. Bulbul explained about feminist economics, historical background, and the origin of economics institution from Cold War era. Then we also discussed about Bretton Woods systems, Washington Consensus, and the explanation of description and from each international financial institution, such as World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and World Trade Organization.
And I apologize for taking your time and, delaying. I don't know what time it is for you, lunch, I guess. And yeah.
Okay, that is okay, Professor Bulbul. And right now in Indonesia, we are currently in 3:47 p.m. So it is already ahead of our lunchtime, but that is okay because we had a very insightful time with you. Okay, and thank you so much, Tiffany, for the recap. So participants, now we have come to an almost edge of this agenda. I encourage to all the participants, if any of you want to raise questions for our distinguished speakers, be it Ms. Erza or Professor Bulbul, you may state your questions directly to the speakers by activating the raise hand features on your Zoom, or you may type your questions via chat box if you're having a trouble to speak directly to the speakers. And if you have a special questions to Mr. Anggun, since Mr. Anggun is currently not on the Zoom, so you may send the questions via email at a.trisnanto@ub.ac.id. Okay, so participant, this is a really honoring opportunity for us to directly discuss with the experts. Here we have Ms. Erza and Professor Bulbul. So I encourage to all the participants to not miss the change. Plus, there will be a special gift for those who raise the questions and also turning on the camera. So I hope you guys don't miss the change for today. Okay, we have one participant raised.
In complete, in vogue to look at political economy, you're making a seductive gift also there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thank you very much, Ms. Bubu. Okay, so we have one person raise the hand. We have Zarfan Gumanti. You may have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Tis, for the opportunity. Okay, this question is specifically, I specifically being asked to Ms. Bulbul, to Professor Bulbul. Okay, first thing first, I wanna apologize if my question is too simple, but it's something that I failed to understand for a long time. I have already tried to seek the answer, but it didn't satisfy me at all. Well, I still don't understand. If we look back in the context of the World Bank, as far as I know, they get their funds from the investment, member fees, and also donation from richer countries. I want to specifically highlight the funds from the richer countries. Why would a richer country donate their funds to the World Bank when as far as I know, there is no guarantee in the loan program. There's no such thing as the underdeveloped country that loan their money to the World Bank. They didn't give any specific guarantee like we as an individual may be lending money from the bank. Ms. Bulbul, like for example, if I want to loan money from the bank, I have to give my car document and stuff, But in the context of underdeveloped country, when they are lending money to the World Bank, they didn't have to do such a thing, and that's making me raising a question on why any of this world country giving money voluntary to the World Bank when they didn't get any specific feedbacks to to themselves. When there is a risk when they're giving the money, maybe it will impacting the economy when the underdeveloped country fail to pay back the loans. Maybe that's all from me, Mrs. Bobo.
Okay, thank you very much, Zarfan, for the questions. For the questions Zarfan just has stated before is for Professor Bulbul, but if Ms. Erza have a different perspective, you also may have the floor. Okay, please, first, Professor Bulbul, you may answer the questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Erza, if you want to answer, you can do that as well. So essentially, I think it's a great question because you're looking, but you're using two terms. You're using giving loan, and you're looking at it not as a perspective of something which they're part of, and this is practically to develop your own power dynamic that you're doing it, because World Bank as such would have, for instance, I want to give you an example. World Bank is trying to, an example from India, because it's still brewing, is we had something called the Sagar Sarovar Dam. I don't know if you've heard of it, which is, there's a protest today. It's only called the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Have you heard of this? It's like a revolution against the dam which was being constructed, and it's still on. If you've heard of Medha Patkar, Arundhati Roy and others who are, strongly protesting about it. And this was something which was a World Bank project, ostensibly to improve the scenario and to build dams. And as soon as the World Bank saw there was so much of protest against it, the Andolan means a revolution. There was a revolution. So this, and they called it Narmada Bachao. Narmada is the name of the river. Bachao means to save. To save the Narmada was this whole movement which has come up. As soon as this came up, the World Bank withdrew from that project, despite the fact that they had projected it as something which would, be tremendously lead to economic growth. Because there was a backlash against it, they withdrew from that, and the government of India was stuck with this dam, and they had to, you couldn't midway leave something like that. The aid had been given initially, it got stopped, and we had to continue with it. And till date, you have the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is this protest which is going on. People are sitting on their area saying that we are getting displaced. It's meant a whole lot of cultural ethos as well. So the World Bank, in its vogue to make a difference in terms of its own thinking and to create its influences, spheres of influence, actually does that. And when you are saying, why would anybody give loan? They're not giving a loan. It's part of that package deal when you're, part of that kind of a scenario, because your influence would increase in terms of the country specific way in which it is used. And somewhere along the line, the goal that it has, the World Bank has said, it has to meet some goal, if nothing else, because even these countries are going to question. But we, the recipient countries like us, were not in a position, now perhaps some of us are, were not in a position to question the kind of loan that was given. So, it's very simply, there is no simple cost benefit analysis that you can do that we are incurring this cost and this is the benefit we are getting. The benefit is long term. It has a macro perspective, which you need to perceive in terms of the influence that World Bank would have over a period of time. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't want to be technical on this quarter that, the kind of loan that's given and stuff like that. But then you have these, as I did, 5 organizations within the World Bank. You have the International Finance, each of them would have a different kind of a thing. You have the International Finance Corporation, you have the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, you have the dispute settlement. So in case of anything on that quarter, the International Development Association, and of course, what is the original one, which is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So through these agencies, the way it's maneuvered and taken, they're not going to be incurring losses. And you are right, that it's not an altruistic thing that I want to give, I want to donate, and that's why I'm trying to do good in that sense of the term. They're hoping to get a long-term benefit and an association through that. And that's the kind of package deal that we are talking about. I don't know, Ezra, if you want to add something more to that.
Maybe I'll just add a little bit, but I think Professor Bobo James already mentioned it quite concisely. If I get the question correctly, you're wondering why there is no collateral, right? We don't need jaminan when we actually provide money to developing countries, right? So following on from what Professor James has mentioned before, when you look at the structure of the World Bank Group, it's called the World Bank Group because there are actually 5 institutions within the World Bank. You would have the one that we're borrowing from is the IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And the other one was actually called International Development Agency, I think. Both of them provide loans, but IDA within the World Bank Group is actually providing lower concessional loans compared to the IBRD ones. So the one, if you're looking from a perspective of the donor, you would see that the IDA was actually something that is much more risky in the sense because you're actually providing loans with the lower rates than market rates. But I think it's we cannot actually just analyze it from the economic perspective, as Professor James mentioned before. If you're looking from the economic perspective, one benefit that you can actually see is perhaps as long as investment is pouring into the country, when the condition of the economy is actually increasing, then most likely foreign investment are going to come into the country. That's, if you like, economic explanation for that. But in terms of World Bank, we're not just talking about economics, and that's the key take, right? We're also talking about the political aspect of World Bank. So I think this relates to what Dr. Anggun has mentioned before about institutionalism, because when you borrow, the way World Bank works is, you might be familiar with the terms like $1, one vote, meaning that you have more money in there, you will get more votes there, and then you can actually decide how World Bank is going to be run, and then stuff like that. So it's also a matter of political influence. When you're a donor and then you lend money to the recipient countries, you actually get to quote, decide how their political systems are going to work, how they're going to distribute the money, how their institutions are going to work. So like Dr. Anggun mentioned earlier about the institutions, like the types of decision making within the rural areas that's going to be required if you're going to accept projects from the World Bank, for example. So you see that when we talk about why there is no collateral when you're lending money, because it works like a conventional bank in the sense that if I borrow money, then I will ask for like my car or my house in the bank, because the sort of collateral within the international institutions, particularly within the World Bank, is not something that is tangible. It's not something that can be measured within the material sense. It's mostly something that you can actually influence in the long run. You can feel in the long run, like what Professor James just mentioned. So yeah, it's collateral in the sense of it's not material collateral. It's something much more influential in terms of non-material aspect. I hope that sort of clears up.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Erza, and also Professor Bulbul for the answer. Zarfan, do you have any feedback regarding the answers?
Maybe I'm trying to summarize what has been told by Ms. Bulbul and Ms. Erza. So I get that there is no, it actually has a cost benefit in the long term, right? Like recipient countries need to follow the macroeconomical rules being provided by the World Bank. Isn't it right? Also, in a deeper context, there is it's a matter of long-term political influence for the other country that is donated to the World Bank. They have a hope to get those long-term benefits, right? And why there is no collateral? Because the collateral is not something that can be measured in material context, but specifically, it's more in influential context, right? This is Erza and Ms. Bulbul. I think I get it now. Thank you to Ms. Erza and Ms. Bulbul.
Okay, thank you very much also, Zarfan, for the questions. Now we can move to the next questions. If there are any questions on the floor, I would encourage all the participants to state the questions directly to the speakers here, or you may type the questions via chat box.
Okay, while we waiting for the next question from participant, I will ask to Ms. Erza and Prof. Bulbul first. So what is the negative impact of trade liberalizations, especially in Indonesia context? How Indonesia as a developing countries can survive in the middle of trade liberalization? Can you explain that? Maybe for Ms. Erza first. Thank you, Ms.
Okay. So this is it's not an easy question to answer honestly because there's so much factors to consider there. But probably I'll just try to answer it in the simple way. Okay. So basically, the thing is, trade liberalization. We always seem to perceive trade liberalization as something negative. Like, for example, if we're saying that we should cover up our economy and stuff like that, and we tend to see trade liberalization as something that is going to be destructive for our economy. But the thing that how the economy currently works right now is that it's impossible to actually cover everything of our economy from exports or from imports or from other countries. So what you can actually do is actually be strategic in terms of how you utilize this trade liberalization. For example, you need to open up about specific things that can actually increase your economy. For example, if you're in need of developing your technology, then perhaps you're going to need some raw materials to support that. And so in case of Indonesia, I think there are two aspects that we need to protect. The first one is that to protect our small and medium enterprises. Our small and medium enterprises is one aspect of the economy that is prone to actually be the victim of trade liberalizations. They don't get much opportunity to actually export their stuff. They are often the first sector of the economy that goes down if there's too much trade liberalization. So this is the first safeguard that we need to actually protect. This is the small and medium enterprises. And then the second one is about the strategic economy. Like if we're trying to build some strategic economies in that sense, so we actually need to outline which economies we're trying to develop at the moment, and then this is the one that we need to protect. So it's in a way it can be considered as some sort of economic nationalism, but face it, I think most countries, at least in the developing world, tends to be a bit nationalistic, economic nationalistic at sense. So it's actually impossible to actually close everything, but we need to be much more strategic in terms of protecting the most vulnerable groups within our economy. And I think that's two of the most vulnerable economy. And then the third one I think that we need to remember is that trade works reciprocity. So there's a reciprocity principle within trade, meaning that if you get too protective within your economy, then most likely your products are going to be refused by other countries as well. So you need to find the right balance in there. It's sort of a bit tricky, but looking at Indonesian ideology and ideas about how trade works, I think we need to work on that. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Miss, thank you for the explanation. So can I have one more questions for you, Miss? Okay, so what are the real impacts of World Trade Organization on labor wages, especially in Indonesia context?
Okay, my answer for this is going to be highly theoretical, so apologies first. So basically the impact on the labor, the theory, there's a theory called Heckscher-Ohlin theory. So it's basically the basic assumption is that when you start exporting stuff, in terms of that, when you start doing exporting and importing stuff, the wages between two countries are going to be equal. We are going to start equalizing into each other. So for example, if you're say you're exporting goods which cost like, I don't know, $5 per hour for the wage, and Indonesia it costs like $1 wage. $10 per hour, for example. The price of the wage is going to be equalizing at times. Okay, so in terms of, I'm going to try to answer that in two senses. Yeah, in terms of the labor wage, it's going to be equalizing. So it depends on what we're talking, whether it's going to increase or decrease depending on the goods. And then the second one, the impact on WTO on labor is that. The bad side of trade liberalization is that if it actually kills certain industry within the economy, then that's job loss. Okay, I'll give one example in Indonesia, and this is a real case example. When ASEAN-China Free Trade Area was signed and then it was implemented, many of the Indonesian producers, toy producers, was actually being shifted to no longer producing toys, but rather importing toys. Because it's actually way cheaper to import Chinese toys rather than to actually produce toys itself within Indonesia. And that actually causes a shift in our labor structure because we're no longer working as producers, we're working as importers. And that's going to be likely to happen to other sectors as well. And if we keep doing our free trade agreements without no stricter controls, that's what's going to happen to our labor structure. So there's likely to be a change in the labor structure, of course.
Okay, that's a very wonderful explanation from Ms. Erza. And I think it's enough for the question and answer session for today. This is a really honoring opportunity for us to directly discuss with the expert. Thank you for its speakers for wonderful sessions today about international political economy, especially about international financial institutions and its impact, such as for employment, industry, labor wage, and many more. Okay, before we are officially signing out, you guys please open your camera in documentation sessions. Okay, let me capture the screen. Give your best smile. Okay, guys, can you open your camera? Okay, I will capture the screen in 3, 2, 1. Okay, for next slide. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tiffany. Dear participants and distinguished speakers, after a very insightful sessions that we have done before, unfortunately, we have come to an edge for today's agenda, and we would like to say many, many thanks for all the speakers that have led our great discussions today, and also not to mention for all the participants that have come in today's seminar. We hope we can learn some insight and knowledge from all the presentations that has been presented by Ms. Erza, also Professor Bulbul, and also Mr. Anggon.
Therefore, I am Tiffany Pamela Anggraini and my friend Zahra Nashwa Imtiaz officially signing out as the Master of Ceremony for today. Apologies if there are many mistakes during the today's sessions. Thank you very much for your attention. See you on the next occasion. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Have a good day, everyone.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.